Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, Big Ideas, Concepts for the 250th. I'm Sarah Curitan, Executive Director of the New Jersey Historical Commission, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this program. Over the past 3 years, the Historical Commission has worked with its nonprofit partner, Crossroads of the American Revolution, to prepare for the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States. Our partnership, now known as Revolution NJ, is especially eager to offer tools to anyone who wants to plan their own activities to mark this once-in-a-generation anniversary. Working closely with scholars, public historians, educators, and community members across the state, we identified critical themes that marked the revolutionary period and have continued to shape our nation to the present day. We hope you will find the exploration of these themes as challenging and engaging as we have, and that they will inspire you to plan events and activities that reflect the interests of your communities and organizations. These themes are explored further in a series of recorded programs titled A Bundle of Silences, Reimagining Interpretive Approaches to the Past on the Commission's YouTube channel. We encourage you to dip into these programs as often as you like and consider the lively perspectives offered by leading scholars on themes such as property and sovereignty, inclusion and exclusion, revolutionary ideals, and New Jersey as a battleground. But tonight's program, we're very excited about. Here we invite you to ponder one of the big ideas that confront all of us as we consider our 250 years of history as a nation. Our gifted panel, who you'll meet in just a minute, will consider the fundamental question, what is the American Revolution? We hope you enjoy this lively conversation and continue it with your family, friends, neighbors, and colleagues. We hope you agree that learning about the past and from the past is endlessly fascinating, ever-changing, and always worthwhile. And now let me introduce the Commission's program coordinator, Dr. Mark Lawrence, to welcome tonight's panel. Mark?
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We're super excited to get this first part of our professional development series started. And we thought what better question to kick off the 250th than to ask, what is the American Revolution? What you'll see in the series, the Big Ideas and Concepts for the 250th series, is this exploration of these larger questions, these larger theories and approaches to the past and to the present. And we're hoping that you come in with an open mind and that you really grapple with some of the conversations that are going on here and see it as a beginning and not the end, right? To get these conversations flowing and sort of work off of them and apply them to your own particular life or your own particular interpretations that you're working with at your historic sites or your organizations. I have the distinct privilege today of introducing our moderator, Todd Braisted. Todd Braisted is an author and researcher of Loyalist military studies. His primary focus is on Loyalist military personnel, infrastructure, and campaigns throughout North America. Since 1979, Todd has amassed and transcribed over 40,000 pages of Loyalist and related material from archives and private collections around the world. He has authored numerous journal articles and books, as well as appearing as a guest on episodes of Who Do You Think You Are on CBC and History Detectives on PBS. He is the creator of RoyalProvincial.com, the largest website dedicated to the Loyalist military studies. Todd is a fellow in the Company of Military Historians and a past president of the Bergen County Historical Society. Please welcome me, or please join us in welcoming Todd, and I will be passing it off to him.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you, Sarah, as well. This is fantastic. Welcome, everyone, to the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. It's here. We are already underway. And where better to start than in New Jersey? New Jersey gets some bad raps for things, but I can tell you firsthand, having worked with many of these people for the last year or two, New Jersey is in the lead as far as 250th commemorations are concerned. And a lot of that has to do with the good people at the New Jersey Historical Commission and Crossroads of the American Revolution. We have a lot of talented people here in New Jersey, as you've just seen. And we are very excited to really set the standard as far as 250th anniversaries are concerned. And it's a fantastic honor for me to be asked to moderate a panel of two highly distinguished professors. So I'm going to introduce them now and have them join you rather than listen to me babble. Much better to hear them babble. Our first panelist is Dr. Lucia McMahon. She's currently professor and chair of history at William Paterson University in Wayne, where she regularly teaches courses in early national U.S. history and women's history. She received her PhD in history from Rutgers University, where her dissertation received the Dean's Research Award. She is the author of several books and articles, including Mere Equals, The Paradox of Educated Women in the Early American Republic, from Cornell University Press, and the Journal of Rachel Van Dyke, 1810 to 1811, from the University of Pennsylvania Press. Our second panelist is Dr. LaGarret J. King. He's Associate Professor of Social Studies Education in the Department of Learning and Instruction in the Graduate School of Education at the University at Buffalo. Dr. King earned his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. A former teacher in Texas and Georgia, his research broadly examines how Black history and race are taught and learned in schools and society. So welcome, guys, and welcome to the 250th. It's a pleasure. You can unmute yourself, LaGarret. It's a great pleasure to have you here tonight. And we are going to, as Sarah and Mark mentioned, we're going to examine the real core question of what it is we're doing. Because I said, welcome to the 250th, and we're in now 2022. When I was growing up as a kid in Dumont, I was 12 years old in 1976, and the bicentennial was really kicking off. And to me, as a 12-year-old, the American Revolution was the Revolutionary War. It was that shot fired on Lexington Green. That was the American Revolution. As far as I knew, there were a bunch of farmers on Lexington Green standing around minding their own business, and 700 British troops marched in and opened fire on them. And that was the Revolutionary War's start. So obviously we know it's not quite that simple. But it looks, we need to look deeper and further back. And so the core question really is, and as I certainly learned along the way, what is the difference between the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War? Because if we're looking at 250 years ago right now, and obviously we are, it's why we're here tonight, the American Revolution was already underway. Those shots were not yet fired on Lexington Green, but the American Revolution was certainly underway. So, Dr. McMahon, we're going to start with you. I'm going to ask you the first question. When did the American Revolution start, in your humble opinion?
Well, that depends, right? It depends on, on what you just said, how we define the American Revolution and how we distinguish it from the Revolutionary War itself, right? And the thought that immediately comes to mind, and something I often include in my lectures, is a now famous quote by John Adams writing to a friend in 1818, reflecting back on the Revolutionary era, where he says, the revolution was effected before the war commenced, right? Speaking, precisely to your point, Todd, that the revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments of their duties and obligations, right? So even back then, right, at least people like Adams understood that there was a difference between the war itself and the conditions that made revolution possible, right? And I think you could ask 10 historians that question and you would get 10 different answers, right? And, and they could all be very persuasive, right? In terms of what that particular moment is. And so I think, one way to get at that is to think about what the various sites and spaces that make for a revolution, right? And I think New Jersey, of course, is such an ideal place to consider this because we were so central to the revolution, right? And so in addition to considering the battlefront, which you mentioned, Todd, what were some of the other fronts of the revolution? What are the political changes, the social changes, the economic changes, the cultural changes, and all of those facets get us to articulating this revolutionary spirit. I'm going to stop there just so you also can hear from LaGarret as well on this.
Excellent. And of course, there are no right or wrong
Right.
answers. Do not tell your students that in school, but there are no right and wrong answers tonight. So, Dr. King, same question put to you. When did the American Revolution start?
Oh man, I don't want to be a prick, right? But can we say we're still kind of involved in a revolution, right?
That's part two of the question.
So no. So I know as history educators, as people who love history, and those who teach history, right? Our dates mean so much, right? To us, right? That's why we have these battles over these particular dates. But I look at revolutions as more as ideas and spirit, right? I think I was reading something the other day, and I forget where it was. It was just part of my morning reading, so I do apologize to the author, but I was reading in terms of kind of these notions of ideas, particularly when we look at kind of those founding eras, right? From the Declaration of Independence to the American Revolution to the war, etc. Right? True notions of us understanding what freedom is, right? Whatever that means to us, right? Didn't occur till after the Civil War, right? So I think when this conversation, this question needs to revolve around what do we mean by revolution, right? Is it just kind of these quintessential dates that we all learned as young people, right? Or is it these quintessential ideas, right? That we struggle with, throughout history, right? So not wanting to be kind of that person, right? But I do think those ideas need to be brought up when we begin to start talking about, well, what's a revolution?
All right, I'm going to stick with you because you had mentioned right as you started, is the revolution over? And that true is a central question. Has the revolution ended? Will it ever end? I think of that, folks. If you've never been to the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, it's certainly worth your while. One of the things that I enjoy when you go there, when you go through all the galleries and you see all the important people, but you also see all the ordinary people of the American Revolution. Men, women, children, free, enslaved, you name it, it runs the gambit. And when you get to the end of all the galleries, there is a mirror there. For when you turn the corner, there's a mirror and you're looking at yourself, and it says, you are the face of the revolution, because the revolution is not over.
Yeah.
So again, does the revolution ever end?
Yeah, and I don't think at this particular moment, because of course, all of this is, we're just trying things out, right? And we're working to create better democracies, right, within the space. But even when we think of kind of the historic aspect of the American Revolution, and since I work with educators, K-12 educators, right, there is this kind of tendency to exclude various different people who were instrumental, right? Even when we think of the founders, right? The founders, William Harding was one of the first people to kind of coin that term, founding fathers. And typically he just meant this notion of, folk who were involved in those freedom documents, right? Those who fought through the American Revolution. And typically when we look at through that prism, right, it's strictly white men, right? And there's some implications towards that as we begin to start learning more about our democracy, is that, hey, white men were the ones who created if not the foundation of the country, the intellectual, foundations of the country. And I do think we need to, particularly as educators and those who are interested in history, need to realize that it was everyone's revolution, right? Gary Nash, focused on, Black folk and said it was the African Americans' revolution. And there were some integral details that he said kind of separated the ways in which Black people, right, and I'm sure women and indigenous folk all kind of looked at this revolution a little bit later. But I'll pass it on to the good doctor and then complete my my thoughts a little later.
They're excellent thoughts, and actually we're going to transition to that in a few minutes. So hold those thoughts, please. Dr. McMahon, give you the last word on, has the revolution ended? Will it end? Is there the never-ending story?
I mean, I agree with Dr. King here. I mean, I think, it's often the process of Reconstruction, the post-Civil War period, that is often called an unfinished revolution. It's actually often referred to in those explicit terms. And if you think about what, the Civil War and the Reconstruction era were about, they really were about, extending the goals of the revolutionary generation to be more inclusive, right? To impact a larger group of people. And I think that is also, that unfinished quality, I think, is there. But I also think it's kind of remarkable is in that, our Declaration of Independence, our ideas, our ideals, right? They, this phrase, all men are created equal. And of course we can, argue, which men, and, we can say, well, remember the ladies, what about us, right? But that as a universal concept, that has been something that various groups of people have wanted to just expand, right? and have included to them. And so that's why I think there is indeed still an unfinished quality to the revolution, because that aspiration, that ideal is still central to so many people's experiences today.
Excellent. We're going to stay with you because that leads, as Dr. King touched on, that leads right into our next question here. Whose revolution was it? How did women, people of color, Native Americans, non-landowners, loyalists, how did they experience it? Everyone's experience was different. I mean, if you look at 2.5 million, 3 million people in the colonies at that time, there's 2.5 million or 3 million different stories, people of all different backgrounds. And it's funny because we focus on a lot of the founding fathers. And one of the reasons I think, my opinion, moderator's opinion, is that you look at a dollar bill and there's George Washington, okay? You look at the portraits and it's of the founding fathers. And I think one of the reasons, and you can think I'm crazy here, the Civil War resonates more with people is photography. There's a lot of photographs of people that look much more like modern people, as point of clothing, of hairstyles, of whatever. 18th century people look like they may as well be 15th century people. You got guys in wigs and all this sort of stuff. And it doesn't have quite the closeness of it. That's just my opinion, but we get to see more of a real image. God, I wish there was photography in the 18th century. That would just make things so much easier from a material culture standpoint too. But why don't you lead us with your thoughts on whose revolution was it?
Well, again, I think it's like, everyone's and no one's in some places, right? And here's where I do think that a more expansive and inclusive storytelling helps us get to that picture. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about the 250 celebrations, right? Is that I think, the bicentennial was more focused on the battlefield, on, the founding fathers. It was a more certain stories were being privileged, right? And it wasn't as inclusive. And I think of one of my favorite sort of models for thinking about ways to tell inclusive storytelling is a book that I love, which is by Laura Thatcher Ulrich, A Midwife's Tale. My book is actually, it is literally fallen apart because that's how much I read this book, right? So I went to get it as a prop for the webinar, and I was like, wow, this is a good prop because it is actually literally fallen apart, right? And so maybe I should treat myself to a new copy, right? But what I want to bring from Ulrich's brilliant analysis is she uses the metaphor or theme of a checkerboard or a checkered quilt to talk about the historical record, to talk about historical experiences. And she makes the point that for too long, we kind of only focused on the blue squares, right? The squares of men together interacting with other men. And in doing so, we ignored, the white squares, which were, women together interacting with other women. And we also ignored the threaded squares, the checkered squares that would be men and women coming together. And then if we also, so that's just sort of a brilliant gendered analysis for inclusive storytelling. But if we were then to also include, African Americans, Indigenous people, right, immigrant experience, right, we can see that the checkerboard, becomes a multicolored quilt, right? It gets even more expansive. It would be like a rainbow quilt instead of just black, blue and white. And I think that is often messy and often complicated. And sometimes it's more difficult to find the center, right? Or, to know the exact date or the exact person. Right? But to me, that's what also makes it much more interesting, much more fulfilling, much more likely that people are going to see themselves in the story, as you mentioned, with that, that mirror at the museum, right? The more inclusive our storytelling is, the more multitude of perspectives that we include, the greater chance that I think we're going to connect with more people, and more people are going to see themselves reflected in our past experiences, which of course can then hopefully lead to the re-envisioning of, present and future ways of living, if we want to, think of the past as a way of, bringing together a more democratic and just society, as Dr. King said earlier. I could go on about this way past our time, so I'm going to take a pause so that I let someone else have a word.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I think you and I are similar in that we enjoy the stories of people. I have a lot of friends who are really into the material culture aspect of the period, which is wonderful and great. For me, it's the stories themselves. Because like I said, there's 3 million of them back then. We know a beyond minuscule amount. So that has been my passion for so many years, just trying to dredge up as many of these wonderful stories as possible. Dr. King, same question to you, sir. Whose revolution was it? We have all these different groups, men, women, children, black, white, indigenous people, loyalist, Whig, you name it. It is all over the place. So whose revolution is it?
Yeah, so first the good doctor brought out props, and I was like, man, she brought out props. Now I need to have props, but I can't just get up in the middle of the webinar and go to my bookshelf. But I agree wholeheartedly, right? It's everyone's, but then it's no one's. But I do want to kind of bring up this point where, and extend it a little further than just this notion of inclusive stories, right? We have to kind of, so inclusive stories, yes, but we also have to accept that those inclusive stories may diverge from that national narrative that we have taught for so long, right? So for instance, right, we know like 1/5 of the population, were, Black, right? Whether they were enslaved or they were free, right? And when we talk about the American Revolution within kind of that Black, through Black history, we tend to believe that these people were just darker skinned white people in the ways in which they fought and, strategized within this particular war, right? Without really complicating and understanding that their reasonings to fighting in these particular wars may have been totally different from the reason why many of the colonists were fighting, right? Benjamin Corll has this wonderful quote in his, classic, The Negro in the American Revolution, where he essentially said the Negro role in the Revolution can be best understood by realizing that the Negro didn't have any loyalty, right, to a place, right? Meaning that when we call Black folk who were, fought for the British, call them Loyalists, right? And we call Black folk that fought for the colonists patriots. Were they really patriots and Loyalists in the classical sense, right? Did they really love Britain? Did they really love, the colonists, right? In places that both have oppressed them, right? And I think words and terminology matters, right? There was no love for these particular places, nor were they any form of, loyalty. The loyalty was for freedom, right? So when Lord Dunbar said, hey, in the southern states, hey, we'll free you, they went to the British side. And then once the Continental Army saw, oh my gosh, they're getting manpower, we need to do the same thing, right? We're gonna go to the Continental Army, right? So I think while we are providing these inclusive stories, we also have to be comfortable with these stories that diverge from, these stories, these quote unquote patriotic stories that we tell ourselves about these various groups. So now we're including the various groups, but we also have to not only include their face, we have to include their voices, right? And those voices may be totally different than those voices we have historically shared in our classrooms in the past.
Excellent points. And once again, you guys are making my job so easy because you just lead right into the next questions. So I can do this job. So to further your point, when we look back and see what it is that we're looking at, so much of it is the allure of mythology, legend and lore, as I put it. And anyone who knows me up here in Bergen County knows I have very, very strong feelings about legend and lore. I'm no longer allowed to drive to the town of Closter, but that's a different story. But what does that instill in us? I mean, why do we go for this mythology? I mean, is it bad? Is it good? Does it serve a place? Does it have a place in an academic history as opposed to, say, a national feeling? The George Washington, skipping a coin across the Potomac didn't happen, but every school kid can tell you that story. It gives the national identity that George Washington, great guy, can skip a coin across the Potomac. And certainly none of us would put that in a book. But does that have a place in history? So do these mythologies of the revolution have a place? We'll start with you again, Dr. King.
Man, a historical fiction, I guess, right? Like I'm good for a really good story, right? I think, but when we talk about academic learning and history and what we do in our schools, I think we have to be very, cognizant of those particular myths, right? Because I think the biggest mistakes that one of the biggest mistakes that we have done in our country is that we, for some reason, think history is about patriotism, or history is about loving or not loving or our country, but history is about humanity and citizenship, right? So it's about trying to understand our humanity, which sometimes can be the good, the bad, and the indifferent. And then also history is very closely related to citizenship, because myths can be very dangerous, because in many ways we learn history to try to help us understand who we are as citizens of a democracy. So if we continue to float myths out, maybe a student may say, wow, I'm not a perfect individual, I can't be historically important, right? So if we complicate these, historical narratives, right? These historical people, maybe we can understand that these people struggled, right, with ideas, they struggled with behaviors, they, struggle with all these particular aspects. And I'm saying, and if we want to use the excuse that they were men and women of their times, when there were always different views, right? So in many ways, they decided to be like that. That's just part of their story, right? And one of my favorite historians said, history doesn't love anyone, right? My good friend from Ohio State, Hassan Jeffrey, would say that, hey man, we don't love history, we love nostalgia, right? And if we know it's nostalgia, then I can kind of work with that, right? Because we all, love those stories, right? But to really kind of get at history as humanity, history as citizenship, I think is a better approach to helping us understand and improving our democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Dr. McMahon, your thoughts on this interesting subject?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an important and complex question, right? Especially when we're talking about the American Revolution, which does hold such a pivotal place in our historical imagination, in our sort of national mythology, right? And as Dr. King said, for many, American history, and particularly the history of the Revolution, seems to be synonymous with patriotism, with nationalism, right? And so we only want to focus on the celebratory stories, right? But there is a large part of history that is unsettling and uncomfortable, right? And our willingness to be able to, as Dr. King said, not just include these stories, right? Not just be inclusive, but really sort of grapple with what they mean and how they shape our view of ourselves and our view of our nation. And I think it's so interesting because, it's an interesting time to be a historian, right? And it seems like there are people who don't want to hear just what happened in the past if it doesn't conform to those, celebratory myths, right? Like these, states starting to pass laws about what you can and cannot talk about in the classroom and things like that. And I think that's so dangerous because, we need to be able to grapple with the complexity, even the messiness, even the uncomfortable and unsettling parts of our past, because it is a path and a way forward. It's not just about mythology and, patriotism. It is about, I love how Dr. King phrased it in terms of, questions about citizenship and humanity are really at the center of historical projects.
Absolutely. I remember as a kid, again, at the start of the bicentennial, 1975, 76, reading an article in National Geographic magazine, which of course, as a kid, you love National Geographic magazine. And there was an article on Loyalists. And this was before I probably even heard the word Loyalist. And I think the first sentence of the article was a gentleman up in Canada exclaiming, "You stole our country." and I had no idea what he was talking about until you start to, when you read about people whose stories are not told. So many people do not know 80 to 100,000 Americans left this country during and after the American Revolution. Modern Canada is to a great degree settled by Americans. I remember back in the 80s, the figure they cited was 1 in 7 Canadians could trace lineage to Loyalists from the United States. So, and that's both Black and white. So it's so fascinating about, you know, the stories that are not told. So what we're dealing with is a subject that is, dare I say, complicated. It's easy, I guess, to tell a simple story, that a clean story, that you have good guys and you have bad guys, and the good guys win, because that's what we're accustomed to. But there's this area in the middle and on the periphery of people who are good, bad, or indifferent, or degrees thereof. So it is a very complicated story, and I guess it's our collective job to tell that story for the 250th, and that's really what makes this so exciting. So given what we've talked about tonight and what we've studied for God knows how many years, looking around today, the world today, the United States today, what does the American Revolution mean to people today? Is it in their collective thought? Do they ponder it at all? I try not to think about some of the thoughts of my friends and colleagues at work who have no recollection or concept of the American Revolution, but I don't view that as a microcosm of society as a whole. So what does the American Revolution mean to people today? Dr. McMahon, we're with you, so we'll start with you again.
Well, you know, I think this goes back to what we've been discussing all evening, right? I think, you know, for some people, the American Revolution is probably just, you know, that mythology, right? The founding fathers, the George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, you know, things, you know, it's myth building. And to me, it's more limiting that way, right? I mean, I would rather hear a multitude of perspectives. I think it's so powerful to retell or remap the past, right? To include traditionally underrepresented people, because as I mentioned earlier, I think that idea of allowing people a window in, a way to see themselves reflected in the past so that they can sort of then see themselves, you know, invested in the present and, you know, and working towards a future, a more, you know, just and equitable society is, you know, so crucial to what we do as historians. And as I was preparing my talk for tonight, in addition to, you know, it was a last minute decision to have a prop, right? But one thing I thought of is a quote that often lives inside my head by the civil rights activist James Baldwin, when he speaks about the power of history, right? And when he says that, I'll just read like a little bit of it for the interest of time, but he says, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, that we are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and that history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. And I think, you know, that so beautifully and powerfully speaks to Dr. King's earlier point about the ideas and the words and the concepts that, you know, make for the revolution and make for our understandings of the revolution's place in our collective sense of ourselves.
Oh, well put. It's, I guess, in essence, why it matters. Right? Obviously, this matters. This is very, very important, both on a national level, a state level, and individual level. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the American Revolution, and it is worth examining in as many ways as possible. And that is our task at hand, and it's pretty cool. Dr. King, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this subject as well.
No, I agree with Dr. McMahon. I mean, it depends on who you ask, right? I know it means a lot to a lot of people because from my experience, when you muddy the narrative, people get very upset, about that. So I guess those myths are very powerful, right? And for some, the American Revolution does not mean a whole bunch, right? The founding of the country doesn't mean a whole bunch, right? Until we kind of get this, full equality and equitable nation that the promissory note promised us, right? And so it depends on who you speak to. I do believe that this country will hold on to those myths, right? Hold on to those narratives, hold on to those quintessential founders, right? That they hold dear to their heart. And I guess that's okay, but I think it's, all about helping us understand that, this country is more complex. There's more people right out there that may have differing historical perspectives than that history, and that's probably the most important aspect moving forward, because those narratives do have myths. Those narratives do have implications to how we understand ourselves for today, right? And some of those can be dangerous, right? And some of those can be liberating, but yeah, it means a lot to a whole bunch of people.
Absolutely. It's interesting. Growing up, I remember my dad saying to me, you came from Loyalists. Again, not really understanding what the name meant, but my family settled on Staten Island in the 17th century. Good Dutch folks that they were, and they were indeed Loyalists. And growing up, trying to figure out, but I live in the United States now. How did this happen? And why didn't they not think that was a great idea back in 1776? So it took a lot of research, a lot of digging, and just to try and make some sort of connection to my own family. And then from that expanded out to, well, everybody's family. Mm-hmm. So, I have friends who take this very seriously. They're Loyalist heritage. One friend of mine out in Pittsburgh, when he had a little boy, and growing up, he was running around when he was 4 years old, and went up to his dad with a $1 bill and said, "Dad, why is this rebel's picture on a $1 bill?" So I assure you it is not that degree in my household, but it just shows you that the learning of history can start early. And I'm excited for all of us with the commission and Crossroads and every other entity in and out of New Jersey who is leading us in this commemoration, this examination, this study and celebration of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And with that, I'd like to ask Mark to rejoin us. Mark, we have a lot of folks out there, as far as I can see from participants. Do any of them have any questions for any of us, or did we tell them everything they need to know about the American Revolution on the 250th anniversary? I'm thinking no.
Well, thank you everyone for that stimulating conversation. And I'm sure there are going to be a couple of questions trickling in, and we really urge folks who are attending to feel free to send us any questions. Just working through what we have in the Q&A, I'm just going to read out a couple of comments, and then if there's any questions, I'll let you folks know. But there was a comment that stories are hidden in archives that are waiting to be discovered, and they may change the course of the history as it was told to us in the school.
Yeah, I'm working on a grant project with the New Jersey Council for Social Studies. Yeah, Mark, you were there for the kickoff, right? And these are teachers who are, doing a scholarship in New Jersey history, and just even already kind of some of the hidden gems that have been found, in and they visited Monmouth University's library, and or Monmouth, I guess it was the State Archives, I'm sorry, and the State Archives in Newark. And wow, like, yeah, I feel like there are, particularly in New Jersey, a lot of great stories waiting to be told. And I hope that a lot of the 250th activities that are being planned are about that, are about connecting us more to those, what's right here in New Jersey, right? Because New Jersey really was at so much of the center of the revolutionary story. And so, yeah, I am so excited by, the discoveries that are still there.
I say something about New Jersey teachers. New Jersey teachers are some of the most inquisitive and dynamic teachers out there. Every time I had an opportunity to work with a New Jersey school district or a New Jersey administrator in K-12 education, they have always been wonderful. So keep it up, New Jersey.
Absolutely. If it was not for my teachers growing up, I remember in 5th grade, my 5th grade teacher, Carol Banniking, plug for her there, would walk us around town. Dumont was barely 1.5 square miles. So of course it had 18,000 people in it, and took us to the library. But it wasn't just the library. The library was the Banta House, which in 1780 was burned in a raid on Dumont. Took us to the church, the Old North Church, which was founded in 1723. And the building that's there to this day is from 1801. And you could read the plaque above the doors in Dutch that was written. And I don't speak Dutch, but I could figure out what it said. And the fun part about it, and history is fun. The people writing, engraving this stone had an error. They couldn't spell Scrollenberg correctly. And so they inserted another letter. It was like an original, turn of the century whiteout attempt. But you can't do whiteout in stone that well. So it's there to this day. And it really, just something like that, as innocuous as a typo in a stone, could really just make you get a connection to some poor guy with a hammer and a chisel, and thinking back then to what life must have been like to some limited small degree. And I think that to make some sort of connection is so important, because when you're dealing with a society, my prop time, that lives and dies on its phone, to try and bring people back to a time where this isn't around, and you have to break down to get to the what how can you make a connection. And I know in the collections of the Bergen County Historical Society is a kid's, essentially a student's backpack from, again, the first decade of the 19th century. What kid today doesn't go to school with a backpack full of all their books and stuff? And to see something from over 200 years ago of essentially the same exact thing, except this is wood, it's that, to see the eyes light up and make that sort of connection, that is, to me, that really hits home.
Absolutely. And one of the larger questions we're getting in our Q&A is, Dr. McMahon, what is the name of the book that you were showing?
Yeah, it's so tattered that, like, I can't even, probably see it, right? But it's called A Midwife's Tale: The Life of Martha Ballard, based on her diary, by Laura Thatcher Ulrich. Pretty famous. So if you type in A Midwife's Tale and Ulrich, you'll get the link. Yeah, really, it's actually one of the things I love about it is it does try to recreate that fabric of everyday life that Todd was just talking about, because I think that is the way to get those connections to the past that are so important. That's why I love aspects of material culture and visiting historical places, right? To have that sense of that sense of being able to imagine yourself in the place, I do think makes history come alive and really connects with students in particular.
Thank you. And we have a question for Dr. King. Are citizens sufficiently trained in history to make better voting decisions? And there's a second part to this question, which is, do you believe the American Revolution is a revelation of a new way of life in science, politics, etc.?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Right.
It's just a light question for 6:53.
I mean, geez. Repeat the first part.
No pressure.
Are citizens sufficiently trained in history to make better voting decisions?
Oh my goodness. All right. So we're connecting kind of history to voting, like the rights of voting. Well, I'm a firm believer that every citizen has the right to vote, right? Whether or not they're super intelligent or well educated within, U.S. history or world history or whatever the case may be. I do think that as a collective, right, our citizens are not really, taught the nuances and complexities of history, right? Particularly those who don't, achieve PhDs like, me and the good doctor, but yeah, no, I don't think that there's a connection to the ways in which voting, or whatever the case would be. I could argue about those who make those decisions, whether or not they should know the history of, what they're doing, in terms of the decision makers who make decisions on voting rights. But in terms of that connection, I don't really see a connection. What's the second portion of the question?
I believe the second portion was more about if it's a good frame, if the American Revolution is a revelation of a new way of life in science, politics, and etc. I think speaking more to a idea of as a frame of looking at all of those topics.
Yeah. Oh man, I think history taught that way in general. Should be something that we should all strive for, right? And I believe the American Revolution. I'm sure there was some science and technologies, for various different military, approaches. I'm saying within those spaces. I'm not a military historian, so I can't really speak to that. But just in thinking about modern warfare at that particular time, that would be a wonderful thing to kind of approach the American Revolution, and particularly as a teaching tool. Yeah, so science and technology, all those particular aspects would be a good approach to teaching history just in general.
Right, I agree, and I think there was something revolutionary, right, about this time, right? That that's what we started with, right? Something that did create a new way of thinking and being in the world, and yes, it was unfinished, and yes, it didn't impact all people in the same ways at the same times and stuff. But one of the reasons why I'm an early national historian is that I just love how much experimentation is going on at this time period, right? Like people are trying to figure stuff out. They don't always succeed. They often sometimes fail pretty spectacularly, right? But there is that really sort of sense of, seeing what we can do with this, right? And seeing what we can create. And that to me is fascinating and inspiring. And it also kind of reminds us that there's always different possibilities, right? I mean, one of the things that I think is really important about history is to not think of it as inevitable, right? And to really explore those moments of contingency and to explore those moments where it could have been a different way, right? And there could have been a different outcome, but there's always not just one answer or one sort of neat bow that ties up the story, because I think that also gives us space to, imagine what we could do today, right? To try and get at some of these questions about, how we are organizing our society. But the revolution as revelation, that's poetry. That's just a beautiful turn of phrase too.
If you can share those particular questions, because I'm not ashamed to say that certain questions you have to mull
Yeah,
over, kind of
exactly.
think through, right?
Yeah.
So if we could, get a few of those questions, later, and maybe we both can kind of think really through those particular questions and send back to you all to send to the participants.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And we are getting close to the end of our time. So I do want to leave with one last question to ask folks, which is, and there's so many good questions in our Q&A that we couldn't get to, and I apologize to the public. But this one I think is particularly a good closing question. And let me see if I can find it now that I scrolled out the way for it. As a parent, or in my case, a grandparent, what's the most important thing you think we can tell our children about the American Revolution? I'll open up to everybody. So
I'll go first here. That, as we've brushed on tonight, that it is not over. To study what it is that was started, and by whom, what they accomplished, and what has yet to be accomplished. That the inherent rights and duties of a citizen to fall on them to carry through the noble ideas that started, that may not have been finalized, may not have been achieved at the time, for whatever reason, but that it is now their legacy to continue on that path. My thought.
Yeah.
Dr.
McMahon.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it goes back to what we've been speaking about all evening in terms of the ideas, right? What Dr. King said very early in the program, right? That if we think of the revolution as a constellation of ideas and concepts and aspirations, right? To go back to the James Baldwin quote, it's very powerful. I mean, things like freedom, equality, liberty, right? We might disagree about what these mean, and they might mean different things to different people at different times, right? I think the story of enslaved African Americans in the Revolution just show us that, as Dr. King also alluded to earlier. So, but yeah, there are some powerful ideas and aspirations that were born of this revolutionary era.
And Dr. King.
I think it's everyone's revolution, right? It's not just what we learn in our elementary history courses, right? It's not just what we see in the movies, but it's everyone's revolution. And those revolutions meant various different things, right, to different people, right? Particularly for people of color, Black people, for that particular manner. The revolution was essentially one of the first civil rights movements for those particular people, right? It was one of those ways that written testimonies, were displayed, as well as it was one of the largest slave rebellions in the nation, right? At that particular moment, right? So my thing is, it's everyone's revolution, and not just, one part of our country's revolution.
And thank you so much, everybody, for tonight's amazing conversation. And I'm just going to do a quick shout out for our upcoming events. We do have our quarterly update for the Revolution NJ initiative this Wednesday at 12 o'clock. There's a link on the Crossroads website and also the New Jersey Historical Commission's website. As you've probably seen in our chat, we have a number of resources that are now available for this professional development, including a webinar series that dives into our interpretive framework. These are 30-minute videos that we put together with scholars looking at all sorts of case studies and ways in which they were influenced by the interpretive framework. And then there's also going to be 4 more panel sessions similar to what we saw tonight, exploring questions such as identity, how society structures individual actions, how we know what we know, and how to engage the public. So this is all part of a larger initiative and effort by Revolution NJ to get folks excited and ready for the 250th. And tonight's panel is the kickoff, and we are eternally grateful for the conversations and all the wonderful ideas you guys shared with us tonight.
But it's been a great event, and I'm sure the next panels are going to be even better. Let's go forward with this.
Yes,
Thank you,
thank you.
everyone.
Thank you all so much for coming out. This was, really engaging, and it's the start of lots more great things to come. So.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, everyone. Have a good night.